Let me go ahead and introduce Mandisa. Mandisa Thomas is a native of New York, the founder and president of Black Nonbelievers. Although never formally indoctrinated into belief, Mandisa was heavily exposed into Christianity, Black nationalism, and Islam. As a child, she loved reading and enjoyed various tales of gods from different cultures, including Greek and Ghanaian. Mandisa has many media appearances to her credit, including CBS Sunday Morning, CNN.com, and Playboy, The Humanist, and Jet magazines. She has been a guest on podcasts such as The Humanist Hour and Ask an Atheist, as well as the documentaries Contradiction and My Week in Atheism. Mandisa currently serves on the board for American Atheist, for the American Humanist Association, and previously for Foundation Beyond Belief, the 2016 Reason Rally Coalition, and the Secular Coalition for America. She is also an active speaker and is presented at conferences, conventions for the Freedom from Religion Foundation, Secular Student Alliance, and many others. In 2019, Mandisa was the recipient of the Secular Student Alliance's Backbone Award and named the Freedom from Religion Foundation's Free Thought Heroine. She was the Unitarian Universalist Humanist Association Person of the Year in 2018. As the president of Black Nonbelievers, Mandisa encourages more blacks to come out and stand strong with their nonbelief in the face of such strong religious overtones. Please help me welcome Mandisa Thomas.
Thank you very much, Ron, for that wonderful introduction. Good morning once again. Thank you very much for being here. It is a pleasure to present to you this morning. And yes, the title, I always have to begin this talk with the background for the title of this presentation. So as Ron said, I am a native of New York City, and I am a product of the Black community, which means that I am an old school hip hop head. I'm 43 years old, born in 1976. And so how many of you are familiar with the rap group Public Enemy? Okay, yes, that's a good showing of hands here. So when I debuted this talk, which was in 2017, of course, I have refined it over the years. I was coordinating a title for a mini tour in the Northern California area. And the advisor for the Secular Student Alliance's group at Sacramento City College and I were coming up, we were trying to decide on the name or a title for this talk, because this originated as a previous, from a previous talk. And so we were trying to figure out the best way to draw people in with provocative language, but without it being too harsh. And so he came up with a few titles, and mind you, this is a white guy. This is a white guy, and, he was really cool as hell. So he threw a few titles out there, but then the last one he threw out was Fear of a Black Atheist. And when I saw it, I laughed. I laughed so hard because it was so ironic and it was so poignant. But I thought, well, maybe it might be a bit too much, especially for students. So I said, well, maybe we'll go with another one. But then I also consulted with one of our board members for Black Nonbelievers, and who I consider my sister, Bridget Crutchfield out of Detroit. And when she saw the title, she was like, no, yeah, you need to go with that one. Because, for one, it does play into my love for the hip-hop genre, and it's based off of Public Enemy's album called Fear of a Black Planet, which is so very ironic because, I'm going to go into this for a moment, Kwanzaa was one of the holidays that my family and I celebrated growing up. And I'm going to elaborate on that for a moment. It is an African-American originated holiday, but it can be celebrated by some of everyone. And that particular detail was left out. No offense, but who describes it and who tells the story does make a difference. And it seems that, yes, not only this country, there is a fear of a black planet, especially due to the history of this country. And in this community, And in this country, there does seem to be a fear of a black atheist. And I'm very, very big on using the term atheist because it does describe what we don't believe in, especially with the role that religion has played in this society and how it has impacted certain communities in this country, especially the black community. So while I strongly do identify as humanist, and I understand why, for some of us, the piece about religion and how it has impacted and yes, crippled certain communities is important to tell. And so this is what we're going to partially discuss this morning. So to start, black atheists, we do exist. So Ron kind of gave it away. I was going to mention that yesterday. I didn't get to say that I was in Playboy. That's always fun to say. And I wasn't in there just alone, you know. And again, for the record, it wasn't for any type of spread, though I do encourage that form of expression for anybody. But one of the quotes from the writer, who, by the way, was a former pastor, and he attended his first ever atheist event ever. And one of the quotes that came from the article says, the most encouraging moment of the convention weekend comes when I introduce myself to Mandisa Thomas, president and founder of Black Nonbelievers, an organization dedicated to support and visibility for black atheists. And also, how many of you are members or active members of the American Humanist Association? Good, that's a very good. How many of you received this copy of the July-August issue from 2018? So this was the first time that any publication from within the secular community has featured multiple black atheists and humanist women in its 77 years of publication. So there have been some singular, black folks featured on covers. An American Atheist featured Dr. Tony Penn. How many of you are familiar with him? Okay, now that's not good. So, yeah, this last year, and ironically, these two articles were both from the July-August 2018 issues. So that was kind of a big summer. That was a big summer for us. It was a big summer for me, and I'm very, very proud of that. But the point is that, yes, there are more atheists of color who are out here. And yes, there are many of us who have actually stepped up and have become leaders and who have, that was such a good video because oftentimes we hear from some people that how we become leaders and how we move, it has to be done a certain way. That there has to be this mold or there has to be this thing that we follow. And so we get a lot of questions about, well, why is there a black organization? Why is there black nonbelievers? Why can't we just join under one group? But if you don't understand the dynamic of the black community, or if you've just seen it in passing, but you don't actually engage or actively engage, then it's a bit harder to understand. And so now we are going to get into why religion defines the black community. Now, this United States and across the world, religion is very prevalent. However, within the black community, it is especially prevalent. And this is why, yes, these are the numbers. According to Pew Research, still about 79% of the black community does identify as religious. And this astronomically high, considering that the black population in the United States is around 12%. So while the number of religious nuns are rising, the numbers in the black community are still pretty high. And this is one of the reasons why, because the enslavement of Africans in this country forced African captives to accept Christianity. And these were laws on the books. So especially we had to accept this doctrine of slavery and subjugation and this pie in the sky heaven, suffering while you're alive and then getting those rewards in heaven once you die. So, and of course, as with most of the Judeo-Christian religions, you had to accept it or you did die. And so this became a part of the mental conditioning of the enslaved Africans in this country and their descendants. But the black church became the primary support system once slavery ended and institutionalized racism was enacted and enforced. Now we're talking about the history, 1865 to about the 1870s, once slavery legally ended, and then the Reconstruction period came about, and then that's when you had the enactment of Jim Crow, the Jim Crow laws, and the segregational system, the institutionalized racism that almost effectively disenfranchised the black community, because there was some progress during the Reconstruction period, but of course it gave rise to terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. We were just talking about that. And so there were legal systems and institutionalized systems of racism and injustice that were committed against the black community. So the church became that primary support system that people could rely on for a sense of community. There were many historically black colleges and universities that were started by religious institutions. And so it really, really was a foundation for the community. It was also where many blacks could rise to prominence. They could get dressed on their Sunday best because anywhere else it was hard to do, especially in the South. So there was that sense of a community and that sense of support that was provided particularly for the black community. And that is how the black church became so powerful and its leaders became powerful and prevalent. So we must acknowledge the role that the church played, or why religion is especially prevalent within the black community. But with that acknowledgement of the purpose that it served, the positive purpose that it served, we must understand that it has also been a crippling agent. And this is how religion has crippled the black community. And I strongly assert that it has crippled our community. So the black church, for all of its support and prevalence, has also hijacked the image of the black community historically and currently. How many of you are familiar with Dr. Carter G. Woodson? Okay, so only 2 people's hands went up, and I'm going to tell you why that is a huge problem right now. So Dr. Woodson was an African-American historian who was during the Harlem Renaissance at his height, and his focus was to document black history. He is the author of such books as The Miseducation of the Negro, which was published in 1925. He was a Harvard graduate, worked alongside W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the co-founder of the NAACP. He is the founder of Negro History Week, which is the foundation for, somebody tell me, Black History Month. So Black History Month and the roots and the origins were started by a free thinker, someone who actually challenged the institution of the church. And this is information that is not only important to black history, it's important to American history. And if we're talking about, and I'm going to talk about this later, this will give you something to think about when we are discussing diversifying our communities. And if this is the information that we are not aware of and we don't know, that is part of a problem that we have in our community. So yes, the church has hijacked the image, and he wasn't the only one. There were a number of black humanists, freethinkers, and atheists that were prominent, especially during the Harlem Renaissance. And there's a new book out by Professor Chris Cameron called Black Freethinkers, and it's an anthology. It tells some stories of these humanists and freethinkers that came from the black community from slavery to about civil rights. So I highly recommend, I will give you that information on that book after this talk. So that's one, that's one way. It ignores how we became predominantly Christian in the United States. So I have seen on social media from time to time folks thanking God for slavery. Now, of course, slavery and enslavement did not start with the transatlantic slave trade and with black folks. It has been an unfortunate institution almost since the beginning of time. But when we're talking about the implementation in the United States and against African captives and black folks, Again, it wasn't done because we wanted to accept it. It was that we had to accept it by force. And this is how most black folks in this country still are religious. And that is just something that has always been an elephant in the room conversation, because it has been passed down. And it hasn't necessarily been passed down, or even the same way it was implemented, it pretty much has been passed down that same way. It reinforces dependence on divine intervention and this idea that we need a savior to come and help us, or that we also depend on this savior mentality, that someone is going to come in and save us from all of the trials and tribulations, or something. So the whole prayer, these prayer vigils, when these black folks get shot in the street, or when we're talking about police brutality as we did yesterday, the prayers about it are not going to do the trick. And that has been the front line, that if we pray on it, then things may change. And that has never, even in the Bible, doesn't it say faith without works is dead? I mean, that's from what I understand. Being non-religious, I'm not a Bible scholar, and I'm not afraid to admit that. But from what I get, the information I get, that's even part of the doctrine. But there is a reinforcement and dependence on divine intervention, that either something or someone is going to come in and help save our communities, which has never been the case. It has always been people. The civil rights movement was a human rights movement because people decided that slavery in this country was wrong, that slavery was wrong, and that the mistreatment and the treatment of human beings and subjugating them was wrong. I mean, they happened to be believers, and that's totally fine. But it was because people decided that there was something that needed to be done about it. But the institution of the church does reinforce this idea of someone or something from the outside coming in to save us, or that someone, either one or two individuals, will be the savior of the entire people. And that is such a burden. That is a huge burden to bear for an entire community. And that's something that most people don't consider. The church overall does perpetuate homophobia, sexism, hypocrisy, and all of that stuff. And this has been woven into the fabric of our minds, how we treat people, the patriarchy that we discuss, and it does perpetuate that. How we treat the LGBTQ community, how we treat women, how we treat children, and all of that. Also overlooks abusive actions that are committed by religious people and their leaders. I think I was talking to someone yesterday about how there's a lot of religious hypocrisy in these laws that they try to mandate in these states. There's a lot of it. And in our communities, within our, it isn't much different, because oftentimes, especially religious folks, but people in general, tend to say one thing in public and do something in private. Now, how many of you are familiar with the late Bishop Eddie Long? Okay, yes, a few more hands went up. So for those of you who aren't familiar, he's just one example. He was the leader of New Birth Missionary in Lithonia, Georgia, the metro Atlanta area. This guy in 2004 organized a march against same-gender loving or same-sex marriage. So he was at the forefront of this. Now I read up that he did catch some flack from the Atlanta community, because Atlanta is very, very heavily LGBTQ. But at the end of 2010, there was a scandal that started to surface about him, that he was carrying on inappropriate relations with teenage boys in his church. Yeah. And this had been the talk for years, that he was doing this. But it only came to light very recently. He was buying gifts for these guys with the church's money. He was taking them on private trips around the world. But then when they got too old for him, he discarded them for someone else. So that was, that came about in about November, December of 2010. That's when the news report started to arise. And of course, there were folks who he drew criticism, but then of course, like we hear very commonly from other people, well, they're just men. They're still, men of God. Only God can judge. These, they're men. He'll have to, we have to take pity on these guys. Meanwhile, these are leaders who have actually stood up in their congregations and those pulpits and judged other people and lectured and preached on morality and what it means to live your life right. So the church tends to have, and we can say the same for the Catholic Church too. That has been the case where a lot of crimes that have been committed against people have been swept under the rug in favor of their leaders. Now, this has somewhat been the case recently within the secular community. I do think it is being handled a whole lot better. But in order for us to avoid getting to this space where it becomes decades, generations, and centuries of this, it needs to be countered now, because we don't ever want it to get to this point where we now have generations of folks still overcoming from these institutional factors. Takes money from the community, but doesn't sufficiently give it back. Now, we acknowledge the role that the Black church played in the civil rights movement and in the Black community. And also, but since the 1980s, the Black church has generated almost $500 billion from the community. And there is a good documentary called Black Church, Inc. And it talks about the business of the Black church. It talks about the mega churches and how there are lots of money that are being poured into these grandiose buildings, these grandiose institutions. And definitely we can't leave out some of the white preachers like your Joel Osteen's. But he has a huge Black following. He has a huge Black, attendance because of the way he does cater to that emotional side of folks. And that's something that we need to be aware of. But when we look at the state of our communities, and I'm pretty sure that the state of Arizona isn't much different. When we look at the Black communities and how there is so much put into these churches, into these buildings, but not necessarily the community around it. There is a serious problem there that the many people fail to discuss. But also it keeps people in fear and from seeking the help and solutions that are needed. Going back to the whole pray our problems away. When, especially now where we're speaking more about mental health, our emotional health, as we are identifying more of these things that as people ail us that we were afraid to speak on before. It was only recently that many churches only started addressing the HIV and AIDS epidemic because it wasn't in the Bible or that it was considered something evil. And so meanwhile, there are very high numbers and cases that still affect our communities, but there are so many people who are not getting the information and the help that they need. And we are suffering from preventable diseases and things that we can control a whole lot better if we actually get the clinical and physical help that we need, which in our communities, I still maintain there is a economic disparity that many people don't consider. But having this institution that is so influential in our communities and that generates this type of money and wealth and influence, for us to not be able to rely, or they're still discouraging these clinical solutions that are needed, is a serious problem. And when we talk about fear, to be a Black person in this country and to either openly identify as atheist or non-religious means for some people that you're rejecting your Black identity. And this is the extra added stigma that comes along with being someone who is secular. So many of us in this room have had issues with our families. We've had issues with overcoming religious beliefs just as human beings, and that is something that should be acknowledged. But when you talk about a very highly religious community and you are asserting your, not just criticism, there's plenty of criticism about the church, but when you assert your non-belief, that you have let go of all gods, that you are identifying simply as an atheist, which is a simple definition, that you don't believe in God, spirits, or supernatural beings. That's how I identify. I had one woman tell me that I had a slave mentality. This was 3 years ago. It's actually documented. There's a video of it online. It was at the Atheist Alliance of America's annual conference that took place in Atlanta in 2015. And there was also a Women of Color in Ministries conference taking place that same weekend. And ironically, the executive director at the time thought that she might be able to establish some common ground, especially around, not just Black Lives Matter, but other issues pertaining to the Black community. And when they saw the atheist tables, I understand they started rebuking them because I wasn't there at first. I was still working. Well, I said, well, wait till they get a load of us. And this is why I'm going to go into the next slide. Because when I encountered this one woman who gave me the the whole sister up and down look like, ew, like, who are you? And so when she eventually turned back around to me and she said, well, I just want to know why. Like, what is this? And so I politely explained to her who we were. And she went on and on about how she had a degree in theology and that atheism is just another religion. And so I said, well, it really isn't, but you don't have to be rude. And that's when she just went off. Because she said that as a Black woman, she couldn't believe that I had the nerve to identify as an atheist in front of these white devils. And that's when she said I had a slave mentality, that she felt sorry for my mama and my kids. And does my mama know that I'm out here doing this? Then she went on to say, because of course I had to respond, and I said, well, which God are you referring to? I know my God is a true God. Well, which God are we talking about here? There are hundreds of gods in existence. But then she said that she was going to bathe me and some of the rest of us in the blood of Jesus. And the only reason why it was recorded, the main reason why it was recorded was not to ridicule or humiliate this woman, but it was because people were afraid that she was going to try to jump on me. They were concerned for my safety because she was just acting a fool. But it was indicative of what some of us either go through or what we potentially go through within our communities. But what that encounter told me was that this is one of the main reasons why Black Nonbelievers as an organization exists. And it validated our existence because we're not asserting that we can rid the world or rid our community of religion, but what we can do is try to bring out more Black folks who we pretty much determine that there are more of us out here. There has to be. We're talking about 79%, that's another 21, and probably higher, who are either refusing to or are scared to identify openly. So there needed to be an organization, an organized effort created to help bring us out. And so that's what we did in 2011 to try to break and combat that fear and that stigma that we were facing in our community. So we were started in 2011 locally as Black Nonbelievers of Atlanta. It was just supposed to be a local group because at the time you had Black Atheists of America that was based out of New York. You had African Americans for Humanism, which was a former program of the Center for Inquiry. There was also a Black Skeptics group in Los Angeles. So there was a presence. When I came into the community, I was actually surprised at the presence of Black atheists and humanists and secularists and the fact that they were starting to galvanize. So we wanted to start doing this strictly for the Atlanta area, but we also realized that there was a need for us to connect with the broader community, precisely because the rooms still look like this. That there is still one predominant presence. But it became necessary for us to start meeting on our own to help bring folks out, because it really does make a difference when you see more people who share the similar characteristics. It does make a difference. And so since that time, We've been hosting regular meetings in the Atlanta area, and we still do. We host a lot of in-person events. We have also contributed to some media publications like the AJC, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. We have also contributed to research for some publications that have been put out, some books that have been released by other Black atheists. The first one here is the Ebony Exodus Project by Candice Gorn. She was one of the 5 fierce humanists on the cover of the magazine. And the subtitle is Why Some Black Women Are Walking Out on Religion and Others Should Too. And there's also a personal account from D.K. Evans, which is called Emancipation of a Black Atheist. So we have been instrumental in helping other Black atheists, authors, and activists come to more prominence and actually increasing their visibility and expanding their voices. Because again, we knew they were out there. You know, the mission wasn't to try to get people to just stop believing in God. It was to try to get more people to admit it. So with that, you know, this is what we've been, and not just admit it, but also understand that there is power in building community. There is power in these connections. And yes, the religious community does have the advantage because they've been doing it for so long. There is no reason why. Fellowship is not a religious word. So therefore, it is, yes. But it takes courage to do that, especially when you are representing a polarized position. But it was important for us to do. And again, we've done a number of presentations. I want to say something real quick about this particular picture. The woman in the middle is Annie Pearl Avery. She's based in Selma, Alabama, and I've been so bad I need to contact her and see if she's okay. I met her, my husband and I went down to Montgomery and visited Selma in 2016. And we visited Selma's Slavery and Civil War Museum. And so she was the guide. And so she was taking us through the exhibits. And there was one exhibit about slavery and Christianity and slavery. And when I told her that my husband and I were non-believers, she gave me dap. And so that just went into a whole other conversation. And this also led me to the realization that there are actually more older non-believers out there too, whether they were raised in Christianity, whether they were indoctrinated, or they left, or they never believed but didn't have a support system. So, and we featured her at one of our general meetings in the Atlanta area, and she has also spoken with the Secular Student Alliance. She actually received SSA's Backbone Award in 2017. What's also significant about her is that she was the only participant in the Bloody Sunday March from Selma to Montgomery who was arrested. So she participated in the first one. And yes, she was the only person to have been arrested in that. So we're talking about legacy here. And it was because, not only because we spoke up, but because we represented this organization, that she was able to actually let her hair down and actually talk about it. So again, who is represented does make a difference. It really does. And also too, with that being said, with all of our activities, with our visibility, we are changing people's lives. And so in 2017, we initiated our Being Changes Lives campaign. And this was because a few of our members had actually started expressing that our group has not only changed their lives, but saved it. And so the campaign is a collection of testimonies from members and allies. And they can be submitted anonymously. You can submit them to us. Some of the accounts here talk about their struggles with religion and leaving, and how finding our organization has helped them tremendously. And it's an ongoing campaign. It costs you nothing to submit. You can read a lot of our submissions on the submissions on our website and our social media. And so we begin to tell people stories, and that has been a progressive, a measure in our community, realizing that people's personal experiences and accounts do matter. We are an evidence-based community, and that is awesome, but it does make a difference when we are actually engaging people on the levels that we can all understand and relate to. And so I want to read one of these submissions up here. It reads, "Most days I want to die. I've struggled with suicide and low self-worth for most of my life. One day I got up the courage to tell my dad about the first man to touch me. The next day I watched him shake that man's hand in church. Every pain I've had to pray away with no relief. My father, his mother, his brothers, and both sisters are ministers. I've always been different and searched relentlessly for people who looked and felt like me. Then I found BN. I love how inclusive you are. You let people discover themselves and encourage us on this journey to be free of religion, aka bondage. The connections alone are worth being a part of your organization. Never go away, please." And the hashtag for that, thank you. The hashtag for this campaign is BN Changes Lives. Oh my gosh, I misspelled hashtag. I have to correct that. I am such a grammar person, but so when I see it, I'm like, gotta change it. So I can, I appreciate that people are being polite about that. It's so kind. I'm not sure I could have been, but yes, this is what we've initiated. And again, this speaks to our organization's existence and its importance. And with the multitude of things that we offer, it's definitely needed. So I talked about allies earlier, and this is often, again, a recurring conversation about diversity, inclusion, and how can we get more people of color involved? How can we connect with more young people, women, etc.? Now, one good thing that I am happy to say that has changed in this community is the involvement of women all across the board, and the number of women that are now in leadership positions and that are stepping up to the plate to actually, participate and organize. But when we talk about being an ally, are you really an ally? And just for the record, you don't get to call yourself an ally. We determine that, how good of an ally you are. So we're going to start with some don'ts because, it's important. If you consider yourself an ally to whether it's the Black community at large, whether it is the Black atheist demographic and other marginalized communities that pertain especially to people of color, here's what you shouldn't do. One, don't assume you can't help. I couldn't tell you how many times that people have seen Black non-believers and they just thought, well, it doesn't apply to me. Or that they couldn't speak up. How many of you are familiar with Dragon Con in Atlanta? Yes, Dragon Con is this awesomely huge convention. It's like your science fans, your gaming. It's some of everything. It's amazing. It's similar to Comic-Con, but because it's based in Atlanta, there's just something very special and actually very activist about it. They have a skeptic track. And, there's a skeptic track where it's everything skeptics related. You have some, I think Atheist Alliance of America now incorporates their conference within Dragon Con. So, if you didn't know that, yes. So I was speaking on the skeptic track one year, and there was one gentleman who attended another panel, on another track, and it was about Black women in engineering or something. And I think one of the panelists said that she doesn't think there are any Black atheists out there. And so the gentleman came to the talk and said, he said that he told me what this woman said. And he said, well, I figured that might be something that you could address. I said, but I wasn't there. So that is something that if you knew that, and we were tabling there, we were at the event that entire weekend. So that would have been a good opportunity to say, hey, I know some black atheists that you could talk to over in this area. And so something as simple as spreading the information helps a lot. So never assume that if you hear something like that you cannot help. Also, don't assume that we all care about the same issues or think alike or that we speak for the entire black community. Because this is something that I have actually encountered when I have attended or been in predominantly white spaces. We get questions about the black community. Well, can you explain this? And can you explain that? Well, first of all, are you going to pay me for this information? But, and not just that, that's only halfway joking. But this idea that we carry the burden for our entire community is absolutely ridiculous. The black community has never been a monolith. There's always been different schools of thought, different philosophies, and different ways of doing things. The leaders in our community have never agreed on everything, and that is okay. I mean, that's what makes us human beings. Our community is still one of perseverance, even through this heavy religiosity. And definitely not all black atheists think alike. So again, please don't make that assumption. Sure, there are certain questions that can be asked, but again, we are still human beings like the rest. And again, we don't, nor should we have to speak for an entire community. Don't dismiss the importance of our groups. Again, because this is a specific dynamic that we're dealing with, not only within the black community or the secular community. Again, there is a need for an organization like Black Nonbelievers. So to dismiss it as not being important, or the overarching major issues like church and state separation, reproductive rights, all of these things do impact and affect all of us. But in order to reach those demographics that it may be a bit harder, guess what? You will need to consult and work with organizations like ours. Because again, this is how the message gets across a whole lot more effectively. And don't become defensive when we discuss our concerns. This is something that we encounter a lot within this community, that when we talk about what happens, we cannot get into this conversation without getting into white supremacy, which I always say has hurt all of us. It hurts all of us because it impedes the conversations. It impedes the ability for some people to be honest. Because I'll tell you, it isn't just a black issue, or it isn't just a racist issue. It's also an economic issue. Because guess what? Poor white folks were treated just as badly. But there was still a privilege because of your skin color. And these are things that we cannot get around. So when we talk about this, when we talk about the institutional factors, I'm not saying you did it or that you are responsible, and also too, it isn't just, I'm going to give one example. The American Humanist Association, I was speaking at one of their talks earlier this year. I mean, not one of their talks. They had a speaker series and I was one of their speakers. Sorry for the live folks that are watching via live stream. But there was a gentleman, there were a few people who took the opportunity to not look at the subject matter or the title. They just focused on that I was the president of Black Nonbelievers. And one guy said, well, that's just like calling me White Johnny. And I had time that day. I said, well, I'm looking at your friends list, White Johnny. I don't see no black folks on there. And he got so, are you saying I'm racist? I didn't say you were racist. But looking at what you said and also looking at your friends list, that's saying a lot. However, this is called Black Nonbelievers. It is not called Black Mandisa. And it damn sure wouldn't be called. So it's not about you, White Johnny. And so for all the people who might think like White Johnny in this room, this isn't about you. It isn't about it. It was not created with the intention of what I wanted to do. It was because We felt that there was a need for it, but it wasn't about me. It was about the people. So in considering the people, sometimes we do what's necessary. And guess what? When you are white and you are seeing a person of color on the stage, you don't get to center your perspective at that moment. It should be about listening to the person and listening to the information, because I guarantee you we have all been affected by our education systems and the information that we don't have. And please don't say, I don't see color or race. Yeah, so there are a lot of, yes, we are all one human race. Race is a social and human construct, and actually it's a racist construct, because if you understand how race was created in this country, it was because of slavery. It was to distinguish who was a slave and who was a person of color, who was black, who wasn't. So it is very much a racist and white supremacist construct. There's a lot of documentation on that. There's a lot of good videos on that too that can explain it much better than I can. However, when you say you don't see color or race and that you're just this colorblind person who just loves everybody, we're all human beings, kumbaya, yes, that's a good ideal. But that means you don't see these other factors. That means you don't see the problems with the construct of race in the first place, how other people are treated in these communities, and also how these institutional factors may be affecting how you see and engage people of color and other marginalized communities. So it's saying a lot when you say that. You know, it's very dismissive, and it can also be very ignorant. And this is something that people need to keep in mind if you consider yourself a good ally. But not to end on a bad note, because here are the do's. Because we want to move this forward. We want to move this forward in a way that is productive. So here's what you can and should do if you're an ally. Do listen and learn. You know, I was having a conversation the other day in which, and this is something I say a lot, that many times when we speak or when we're engaged in conversation, we may not listen to understand, but we listen to respond. And that tends to be a human thing, that we just want to get our point across. It oftentimes becomes a debate, or it's a conversation about who is the most correct and how we can kind of almost browbeat each other into submission. So do listen and learn, because there may have been things, and there's a lot of information that you may not have known before. That's okay. But what do we say? When you know better, you do better. So do listen and learn, and do understand that the white leaders in this community, who we hold near and dear for good reason, they are not the complete authorities on information and education in this community. That is something that needs to change. Do adjust your attitudes and actions when presented with new information. Like I said, it's nothing personal. And in some instances, it may be personal, whether it is about the collective issues or whether it is about personal engagement. If you have personally offended someone, or you've done something that was inappropriate, when people are telling you about it, it's not sure, it's a natural defense, or it's a natural reaction to become, well, I didn't mean to do it. But good intentions don't always mean good actions or good outcome. So it's good to adjust your attitudes. If you didn't know it before, there's an opportunity to change it. So and we are a community, again, that prides ourselves on our intellectual capability and presenting people with new information that doesn't just stop with religion and our religious beliefs. That applies in all areas across the board. And that's something that we need to remember. So do make sure we're sufficiently a part of input and not just on one-time efforts. So if you again, that goes back to trying to recruit more people into your leadership, in your boards, and also collaborate and participate. This would be a good way to making sure that people of color, or trying to recruit them for leadership and participation, because that was one element that was missing from that video. It was definitely all white. So that was a little, not to say that there's anything inherently wrong with that, but there are some lenses that other people are thinking of, and it's like, Okay, yeah, just keeping that part in mind though. But collaborate and participate and do so regularly and consistently. It's good to do outreach with different groups in the area. And because this is a humanist group, that message and that language may resonate better with other members of the community in more interfaith work and more human rights work. So that, and also don't do it with the intention of just getting people into your groups. Because then it's like, oh, well, look, we have these black people here now. So now what? That means you're doing it and then that becomes a part of the tokenizing that we really don't want to happen. And also participate with these other organizations, especially if they have goals and missions that are similar to yours and it's something that you care about. Do support them as well, because nothing really happens without very little happens without mutual participation and collaboration and efforts. And we know there are limited resources. That's understandable, but there's always, I'm going to get into that in a minute. But do have information and resources available. You now have a few of our brochures in your collection over there about Black non-believers. So now that you know that you have more information about our organization, you may have learned a few things that you hadn't known before. It is now crucial to impart that information, and when you're engaging other people, particularly people of color, you now have some better reference points that you can use not only for them but for yourself. Because again, this information is important for all of us. Last but not least, donate and support. I'm going to say it one more time. Black Non-Believers is a 501c3 organization. Donations to us are tax deductible. You can make them recurring if you do it online. You can also make them recurring if you decide to mail a check. But we officially became a 501c3 in 2014. Because as our organization grew, as the interest in starting affiliate groups in different cities increased, we increased our scope to a national level. And so we finally became a 501c3 in that year, and we've been going strong ever since. And one of the things that myself, as the founder and the primary leader of the organization, I've had to say, hey, we can't do this without money. And none of our organizations can survive without it. But support and donations don't only come in the form of financially. They come in the form of other resources. If there are some things that you can help us with, or if there are some tools that you may have that we don't, then certainly that, this space is a great resource. It's a great resource for, if there will eventually be a BN group in the Phoenix area. This would be a perfect place. So it doesn't just come simply in the form of financial support, but it's a huge factor, though, I will say. And so just as you see our merchandise table here, these are just some of the folks who sport our swag. And we had some folks this morning who purchased, which we appreciate. But if you want to support our organization and give people more information, what better way to do that than to wear it? And for the most part, I tend to wear a lot of our gear, whenever I'm out. But yes, it is important. And I think it's pretty cool. I may be a bit biased, but our swag is kind of cool. So, but yes, you can support by purchasing merchandise as well, or anything that is eye-grabbing. And there was a gentleman yesterday, and I have to mention this because it turned out to be a very funny conversation. He said, "I like your use of the N-word," and I looked, and I said, "What do you mean by that?" And he said, "No." He pointed to the N in non-believers. And I said, I didn't just say what, but when I almost did, but then when he said non-believers, I thought about it. I said, okay, all right. Okay, but the reason why that was so funny and it was so good was because One of the reasons why we incorporated non-believers into our title was, for one, that there were other black groups that incorporated the other identities. You had, Black Atheists of America, African Americans in Humanism, Black skeptics, so we incorporated Black non-believers, but it also goes beyond the scope of religion. We do not accept anything that doesn't have an evidence or verification base. So, and also too, when people see Black non-believers, they say non-believers in what? Gotcha. So now that starts a whole new conversation about the premise, the purpose of our organization, and what it is that we don't believe in. And then that can cross over to what we do. Because I am a true believer in that, not believer, but for lack of a better word, my atheism defines my humanism. It has given me a better outlook on my life, on this life, and how to help others. And understanding that there is not going to be a God to save us. And understanding that being able to shed those beliefs is one of the most, it can be scary, but it is one of the most liberating things you could ever do for your life. And we encourage people to live a much more authentic life, even though it can be very scary to do so in the midst of this society. But I do want to turn your attention. This year, in 2019, we presented, along with Black Skeptics Group and Women's Leadership Project out of Los Angeles, the first ever Women of Color Beyond Belief conference that took place in Chicago, Illinois. And what was significant about this conference was that all of the speakers, all of the presenters, were women of color in this movement. And I have had the good fortune to have engaged a number of women who are active in this community, but yet when there are larger events, you see us in spots, or we're only maybe one or two speakers amongst a bunch of white folks. And that doesn't mean that we're not getting good information from these folks. However, you got some great information and great perspectives from all of the women who presented. All of them. And I guarantee you there was a difference in how there was engagement and interaction in that space. And there was some of everyone there. Black, white, Latina, you had all groups represented. And it was the brainchild of Sakibu Hutchinson, who I understand was a speaker here previously. She and I have become very close working colleagues. And we are hosting it again for 2020. And so this is the flyer for it. It's taking place September 25th through the 27th of next year. We have early bird rates on the website. The information is also available on the Black Non-Believers website. So if you have never visited Chicago before, please try to fit that into your schedule. And I found one of the great things about doing these events is that you encounter other folks, and especially other women of color. And I actually talked with Tanya Gerard from The Handmaids of Phoenix, and she will be a speaker for this conference next year. And I think all of the handmaids are going to make an attempt to appear at the conference as well. So, because I think there are other people of color who don't know about them, and they should. I think all of us should know about each other's projects, everything that we're doing. This information and our activism is important. And we also started doing an annual cruise convention, now titled BNC Con. And so we feature a number of speakers, primarily from the Black atheist demographic. However, we feature, how many of you are familiar with Darrell Ray with Recovering from Religion? Oh my gosh, he's just one of my most favorite people ever on this planet, because he is such an amazing psychologist. His books are very, very important, and he's just such a down-to-earth guy. If you don't know him, he's the founder of Recovery from Religion, and I also facilitate one of their groups in the Atlanta area. So that's just another thing to add to the hats that I wear. This year, we're doing it again. We'll be aboard the Carnival Magic for 7 nights. So if you've never been on a cruise before, I highly encourage you to consider it, especially with a group of like-minded individuals. It's amazing the level of engagement that we have when you are, on a ship with thousands of people and you are representing a secular or atheist organization. So that type of outreach is possible. And we're going to have a number of speakers, and also just this particular cruise that took place a few weeks ago. We had some salsa dancing lessons. So that was a fun thing to add to it. So we're going to be incorporating a lot of good presentations and information. Compassion and Choices, who was one of the sponsors for yesterday's event, was a sponsor this year, and they're going to be a sponsor for next year. So they're going to talk about the medical aid in dying, end-of-life preparation and transitions and such. So this is the type of information that is important for our community to know as well, and our members. So again, we establish working relationships with other organizations, not just simply because we want them to support our work, which we do, but again, it's a good opportunity for our members to know what others are doing, because again, it's all important. So here are some references or resources. In 2015, I wrote an op-ed piece for CNN. This was a link to it, Confessions of a Black Atheist. How many of you remember the 1-hour series that CNN did on atheists? It was back in 2015. So they came under some fire for only having a few people of color represented. And so I was asked to write a piece on being a Black atheist, the challenges that we face, and the work with Black non-believers. And that link is still very active, very much active. So I do recommend that if you can find it, you can do read the piece. We also had Contradiction, A Question of Faith by Jeremiah Kamara, who it will be featuring his new documentary called Holy Hierarchy, The Religious Roots of Racism. If you attended the Freedom for Religion Foundation's convention this year, you got a chance to screen it twice. Also, Moral Combat by Sakibu Hutchinson, who also was one of the 5 Fierce Humanists on the cover of the magazine. And also our YouTube channel, Black Nonbelievers, Inc. All of the presentations from Women of Color Beyond Belief are now on our YouTube channel. There might be some audio issues there, but I highly recommend that you take a look at the videos as well as our other content from other events, and you can also support us through that. I'll just get this one piece before we get to Q&A. Last year, after starting, we started Black Nonbelievers in 2011, have been growing the organization since 2011. And in the midst of that, I was still working a full-time job as the event services manager at the Centers for Disease Control's Conference Center. I'm also married, I have a family, I have 3 children. And so as my workload from the movement increased, I made the overdue decision to quit my full-time job, to take on activism full-time. And I have never regretted that decision since I made it, because I knew I was going to have to make it, because as this work became important, not just to me, but to the community, there was a commitment and a dedication that I had already made, and I needed to continue to make it. But in order to support it, I now have a Patreon, which is available. It's a subscription website. You can subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month. It does help support my activism in addition to supporting the organization. And what I do there is I tend to write a lot. I tend to share a lot of my thoughts on community and also some other issues. And now it's labeled 18 and up, so you can't just search it. You have to actually type in the link, because you wouldn't be able to find it just online. But that was also very scary. And that there is very little that tends to scare me. But we all have those moments in our lives where when we are making important decisions, We have to consider consequences, and they can be scary. But the need for this work, the necessity of increasing the visibility for our demographic and also providing that support for those who need it outweigh that fear. And it may take some time for individuals to overcome that fear of leaving religion, something that they held so closely, that they held so closely in their lives, and they know that it is very important in their families' lives, which could mean that they are ostracized, which could mean life changes for them. And that support from the communities that we build is needed to combat these fears, whether they are on a personal or professional or collective level. And we have to continue to support and also understand what that means for certain people, and that we can definitely, even if we don't eliminate it, we can alleviate those fears. So, thank you.
We have 5 to 7 minutes for questions.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Got one behind you.
Loved your talk. I want to know, I liked your presentation. How can I get a copy of it? Can I like emailed you or something, or I just did
so there's a live stream link here, which
okay.
I believe is archived.
Okay.
So you can go to HSGP's YouTube
point.
page.
I should know that.
And I do think that
I should know that. Thank you.
Yeah, there are. Yeah. So the question was, how can you get a copy? Yep, you can get a copy as soon as this talk is probably over. And I'm thinking that there are some other recorded presentations too. Yes, sir.
Will there be a BN here in Phoenix?
We're kind of discussing that. We hope that there will be not just one person, but it's going to have to take a number of people to actually step up and help organize. And there really isn't that much involved with it. Most of our events tend to be social, so we only ask that at least 1 to 2 meetups a month are hosted, and they can be done so in conjunction with your local group. So we hope that in the near future that there will be a B in a Phoenix, because we certainly can use it here, I'm sure.
Yeah. Thanks. Great speech.
Thank you. There was a couple of questions up here. Yeah, I want to. Yes, the gentleman.
Is this on?
It is.
So this speaks to your, you were talking about the church and how leadership sometimes comes out of the church, sometimes it comes out of the secular. You've obviously come out of the secular, but when it regards the salvation of black people, and we've had Malcolm X and Medgar Evers and Dr. Martin Luther King, all the times that a black person stands up as a leader, it seems to mark them as somebody, as a target. And I'm wondering if you have felt that in your own life, and you did mention that one girl was kind of on you about
That one lady.
you know, you're not black and all this kind of stuff. And I was wondering, how do you deal with that fear? Because it's a real fear.
So the question is, if for those of you who weren't able to hear, which I think might, the question is, do I fear any perhaps life-threatening backlash from stepping up as a leader in this community, and just especially as an atheist? So I have thought about that. I'm glad that we live in a time where now, I know there are some organizations that have received death threats. I've thought about it. I haven't received death threats yet. And I have, there have been folks who have written to us trying to either save our souls or try to understand why, they were so hurt, like they knew me. Why don't you believe anymore? I don't understand. But We haven't. If that comes, then I'll make sure I take the necessary precautions, because now, having committed myself, I may not think that I would immediately die from being in this community, but it is certainly something now I have dedicated my life to, or I've given my life to. And so that is something that I am very proud of. And so if it means that in any way that in this life that something happens, which I'm hoping it doesn't, I hope people know, not just my family, but people know that it was done because it was necessary, and not because I'm trying to make everyone in our community in the world an atheist simply because I am, but because people need to know we exist and that we are doing things for our community openly as atheists, and I'm willing to die on that. Yes, ma'am.
This is about one of your don'ts that you mentioned about not asking a person of a particular group a question and assuming that, you know, they're representing everybody and they're going to give you the black answer. Because I've occasionally met people who belong to some group that I know very little about and I'm very curious about something, and I've been guilty of that, but I'm very careful to preface the question by saying, I know that you don't speak for everybody, I just want your personal opinion or what you've heard about this issue. Because to me, I mean, that seems better than not asking and continuing to know nothing. So what's your advice on that? Is there a better way to go about it or a better way to find information? Assuming that I'm making that very
That's a good way
clear.
right there. You know, prefacing it, you just basically said it. That's something that you would need to say to everybody or people who don't know to do that. You know, it is good to ask, you know, preface it, well, I know you're not, I just want your personal view on this. What is your take on it? You know,
I may be the only person of that group that I, you know, that
right, if you know, and they may be able to point you to someone else after that, and that's totally fine. But yes, something as simple as that makes a huge difference.
Okay.
And if we do have 2 volunteers that are interested in starting the Black Non-Believers, we would be interested in hosting that here. So.
Yeah, we can talk more about that later.
Yeah, I want to thank you. Thank you for coming out here and sharing your talk. That was very enlightening. Two things. One is what she was just saying. Yeah, when I turn that around and somebody wants to say, well, I speak for all white people, it's like, no. So it's easy to understand how that comes across if you just put it back on yourself. And the other thing I wanted to say was I really appreciate the fact that you call yourselves non-believers. You brought that up as a differentiation between atheists, and I think it's important to recognize there's a lot of things in our society we take on faith, not just religion. And I think it's wise for us to challenge all of those assumptions and look into all of those beliefs and go, where did these come from and how do they, if they serve us and do they serve us?
Absolutely.
Can we challenge them? So thank you.
Thank you. And I will say to that, if having that skeptical mind leads you to fully identify as an atheist, embrace it and wear it. Because that is one of the best things you can do, is to not just wear it, you know, not wear it on your shoulders, but also live it. And that's how we are as atheists, humanists, the skeptic, non-believers, etc. Yes, that is a very, very important point. But yes, we don't. The whole point is to definitely question everything and to make sure that we approach everything with that inquisitive and skeptical mind. That is the critical thinking piece that unfortunately something that religion has been a major part of squashing for a lot of people. And so that is something that we have to take back. So yes, thank you.
I enjoyed your redefinition of the N-word. I think we could do something about that. Like, well, yeah. Every time we hear it, say, "Oh, you mean non-believers?"
Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
My comment was that we have set this building in the heart of Mormon territory. That doesn't get us into the black community, and that means that most blacks are going to have to make the effort to come here because we can't take the building there.
You may not be able to take the building there, but you can take yourself there.
Well, some of us can and some of us can't. I was hoping that the black students from ASU would, because we're not that far away. But so far we have not been able to encourage that much. We do have a few, and we welcome them. In fact, they're our friends. We need more, and somehow, and that goes for not only blacks, but the Asians and the Latinos.
Yes, yes. Some of y'all may not be able to physically, but when we're talking about doing more outreach, there's gonna have to be that do what it takes. As a person who is big on putting things into action and execution, there are going to be some steps, and stepping out of that comfort zone that's going to have to happen, even if they don't come right away. There's going to have to be a better effort into stepping into these communities. And also, when they come here, will this building, and not just what it represents, because there's a lot of white people on these walls. Now, not to say, again, that there's anything wrong with that, but there needs to be a better effort to have something represented that would be encouraging to people from different backgrounds, and that is something that you need to think about. So,
Thank you very much, Mandisa. It's our tradition here to mug our speakers. So,
thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. It's been great.
Thanks.